Hello everyone, I'm Charlie Calderon. I'm an interim manager of a group called Enterprise Integration. So we will be responsible for implementing some of the things that come out of the interoperability effort over the next probably measured in years. So that's where I come in. So I want to talk a little bit about just building on some of the things that Phyllis was talking about, some of the foundational things that we think need to be in place for some of the other things we'll talk about today to be successful. So along the lines of governance and decision making, so we can advance. I'm going to talk a little bit about big G governance and little g governance. So the people who actually we consider part of our governing bodies, and then the things that we do, the standards by which we operate respectively. So I will use them interchangeably, and I'm sorry for that. So one of the things that we need governance to do is to adopt a service standard. And we think it's important not just for interoperability and the services and infrastructure that come out of this effort to comply with that service standard, but that IT in general on this campus comply with that service standard. So building on some of the questions Phyllis was asking, it's important that we develop this together. It's important then that also implementers comply with this standard as well. So things that people are doing, services people are running outside of interoperability need to comply with this. We need governance to promote collaboration across campus. So one of the ways in which this is very important is in data release policies, how data is used, standard sort of data release practices. Campus shouldn't get a different answer about using data if you go to OHR or if you go to the registrar or if you go to do it. Those are challenges that we face today, and we need campus governance to buy into this idea that how we use data should be based on data classification, should be based on risk, should be based on what you're doing with that data. And without that, this kind of falls apart. So that's something we need governance to kind of push for us and buy into. We also need governance to help us define campus definitions for the data that we're using. So we need to talk about things in a standardized way, regardless of where they're expressed. And I know Office of Data Management is sort of starting to do this, right? This concept of the data cookbook, for example, is something that I know that they are pushing, that they have sort of thought up. And we need more of those types of things for interoperability to function. If we don't have common definitions for data, then we might treat a definition of a student differently given our specific use case or given where we're getting that data from. So we need to start standardizing some of those things. And then finally, we need governance to, once in the hopefully not too distant future, once we've started to stand up some of these things, once we've started to be able to express these common definitions in the infrastructure, we need campus and governance to kind of buy into using that infrastructure. So on to decision making. There's a reality here, though, that not everything is going to live in this perfect world. Not everything is going to comply with these definitions that everyone has agreed to and bought into. We're going to have one-off cases. Building on a point David made, we're going to need to figure out how to work with ad hoc situations, right? So we need ways to make those decisions. We need ways to approve usage of things that might be outside of our norms, things that might be stamped with the governance seal of approval, as it were. So we need to develop decision-making frameworks that help us decide when that's okay, when that's not okay. We also need to sort of, I guess, have someone own those decisions, sort of a risk owner or a decision owner. If we're not using common data definitions or common infrastructure, what are the risks of doing that? And who's going to sign off on those risks? For example, when cybersecurity does a risk management assessment, they might come back with certain findings that say you need to fix these things about your service or fix these things about what you're offering. You can choose to do those things or not. And if not, someone owns that decision. It's the same for all sorts of decision making around how we use data and how we use the infrastructure that we're providing and that exists around campus. So then at a smaller level, sort of at the tactical level, we're also going to need to develop a decision-making framework by which we operate over the next few years, so that people actually implementing and deciding how we move forward with interoperability services and infrastructure. Some of those things that we're going to need to do, just being realistic, is we're going to need to lean out some of the services that Do It provides. So how are we making those decisions? We need to be open and transparent about that, but we also need to be realistic that we need to focus on this interoperability state and not necessarily some of the things that we've done over the past years to sort of provide services to campus. We're going to need help prioritizing the projects. So I'm not necessarily going into a sequencing of what you're going to see later at this point, but we're going to need help determining what comes first. These things all can't happen concurrently. So what's our decision-making framework around that? And how do we maintain transparency? And what does that actually mean? So how do we inform campus about what we're doing? How do we establish a feedback loop to understand if we're on the right path? So moving in that vein, talking a little bit about our change management strategies. These are some of the things that we heard in the first information session from folks. So I think the biggest theme was be transparent and communicate about what you're doing. So we asked a little bit about, okay, what does that actually mean to you? We still have that question. We're going to continue to have that question. But one of the things that I think we'd really like some more feedback on is how can we be transparent about some of these things? Is it transparency about our projects? Is it about transparency about how we're prioritizing? Is it transparency about what? So that's something that we'd like some feedback on. We'd also, again, like to share kind of how we're going about this over the next few years. What comes first? What comes next? So one of the things that I would like to ask folks to think about, either in the feedback cards or in the Google Sheet, is what would you use the stuff you're going to hear about today for if it existed right now? What would be easier? What could you do faster? What could you do cheaper, et cetera? What are the things that you could do to enable your business if you had some of these things today? That might give us a sense of what's important to the folks who are participating in this effort.
Do you want to give them time or no?
Is this one working?
Mm-hmm. It's working.
Okay, so yeah, why don't we talk about that? You can fill out. I have a stub question in the document, so you can fill it out there. But does anyone have any ideas right now about what you'd like to see, based on perhaps feedback from what you saw in the first session, or based on, for example, the standards that we were talking about? And if not, then certainly okay to think about this throughout, and we'll happily entertain questions and feedback. Okay, I think we can move on.
So Charlie,
yeah,
you want to mention that we'll leave that document available for.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the document is going to be up throughout, so we will be monitoring, keep writing in it as questions come up, as ideas come up. We'll talk about this throughout, and then also a little bit at the end in our summary and our Q&A, we can kind of take a look at what has gone into that document and kind of bring up some of those points. David?
I'm talking a lot. You said something about IT to adopt a standard. I'm a little concerned that a standard will fit all of our needs. So I think that each project needs to adopt an appropriate standard for each service. I don't know, unless you have a standard that includes all the other variations on the standard, I don't think there's one standard for what we do.
Yeah, I think also when we talk about a service standard, it might be a matter of raising it up to the right level. A service standard maybe shouldn't get tactical. It shouldn't talk about some of those things that change often. So when we started thinking about service standards, we asked, does this help us make a decision? If it doesn't help us make a decision, it maybe doesn't belong in our service standard. And is it at the right level? So along with the service standard needs to come perhaps another cookbook of sorts things that might change more frequently, things that we might need to adapt to individual services. But I think a service standard should be broad enough that it should be able to cover how we operate across our portfolio and across campus. Phyllis, would you agree with that characterization?
I think it's certainly worth a try. That's, I mean, my feeling, but it seems like it's worth a try. And I think we have peers who, frankly, I mean, the US government and the UK government are bigger and more complicated organizations than ours. And they have found a way to create a standard that is comprehensive of, it's something that everyone that's working in IT gets behind. And I think part of it really does speak to Charlie's point about the level of information. I think it is and should be fairly high level, but stitching these different and disparate domains together in a way that they are kind of more integrated than they are currently. And we definitely are going to need more detailed, more nuance at kind of at the complementary level, whether that's around policies or in guides and best practices and other things. There's a lot of supplemental content that I think will be needed to help fill out and help us stay on track with the standard. But I think it's at least a hypothesis that it's at least worth the shot to try to have a unifying standard.
Nope.
Just so I'm not lost in the weeds here, we're talking about taking those two examples kind of from the digital services and from the UK and saying, well, if we made up something of our own like this regarding services, which of these things might we use? What other things might we add in there? Is that what we're talking about this second? Or is like, for example, one of them was like use iterative processes to be able to find out whether or not what it actually did is what people actually wanted. Is that's what that's the discussion is right this second?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, I have a lot of, I guess, questions going through my mind, and I don't know if I'm going to articulate it very well right now. I'll try to do that later. I'm curious about the issues that maybe don't fit in this box, the political decisions that get made at some level, or the statutory decisions that get made. So there's mandates or some product that gets thrown out there and you have to do, which doesn't seem like it fits in this process, but maybe a part of it does. So how does that translate into what was kind of mandated into how do we get the community to kind of guide that process? That's one part of it. The other part is there a timeline that is kind of put in place with this as far as how quickly these standards should be put into place that you can actually get into the pipeline?
So I don't necessarily know about timeline. One thing that I think is important to emphasize, just to kind of reiterate, is that we are not necessarily driving these things. We think that these are ideals that we sort of want to rest on. We want campus to agree with these things and campus to kind of push these efforts. So that means a lot in terms of timeline and scope of what a standard might look like, when it might be adopted. To your question, though, about things that maybe don't fit in this box, I think I have an understanding of what you're asking, but maybe if you clarify if I'm going down the wrong path, Alan. You know, when you have to do a project or when you have to maybe use data in a way that doesn't fit nicely within our standard or within campus data sort of guidelines, or when you need to use data elements in a way that isn't kind of how I characterized earlier, kind of the stamp of governance approval, what do you do? Is that the right track? Is that kind of what you were asking, or?
I guess the one things I'm thinking of are, we get broad mandates of maybe what you kind of need to do, but there's a lot of nuance of how to implement it. And sometimes the nuance is of how to implement it is lost, and the mandate is just taken and thrown in place. Does that make sense? Or
maybe.
So you need to, secure all desktops. Well, how do you do that is kind of up in the air, but
is the entity in charge of that just mandating that this is how we're gonna do it, rather than just saying, you know,
I see.
we've been asked to do this, how are we gonna do this?
So I think what we're kind of trying to get at here is less the how do you go about doing something, but what is appropriate usage of data and policies sort of at a campus-wide level. I think, and maybe I'm picking too much on your specific example, these processes wouldn't necessarily get into that sort of really deep tactical level. We're kind of talking about what are appropriate ways to use student data. What are appropriate ways to use other forms of data? What does a student data object look like? And I know students are really hard one. I'm oversimplifying here. But I think that's more the level at which we're talking. When maybe you have a mandate that doesn't fit within, you know, how you might use data or what might be approved, there need to be ways to kind of push through a decision-making process, maybe through a governance body that basically says, yes, we recognize you have this mandate. Yes, it maybe fits outside of these cookie cutter examples that we've kind of given, but we can approve this under these kind of circumstances.
This may be a little bit naive, but I think our hope with this standard, and I think the way that this service standard has worked for the U.S. government and the UK government has been that sometimes when we get those mandates and we have to sort of, someone says do this thing and shove it through, I'm guessing that some of us have felt like, or you felt like when that's happened, that you're like, this doesn't make any sense, or this is going to have a bad impact on our end users, or it's going to, and so that in some ways maybe this framework could equip you with more ground to stand on to say, wait, before we jump to implementing and delivering the solution and running this through, we have to make sure that we understand how this is going to impact folks and work together to figure it out. So I don't think it's at that sort of at a project level, but more at a how we work and what kinds of questions we're asking and how we evaluate and move forward. So I don't know, I think maybe part of this is, our thought is I think even kind of building off something Dave said is, maybe we kind of draft something to react to so that we're not talking about it in quite such an abstract way, and see what you think about it and give some feedback. We just didn't want to jump to that if it was like, this doesn't feel like it's, you know, doesn't feel like it has value, but we wanted to kind of get a sense of if it's worth at least trying this. And if it is, then we're happy to kind of proceed with drafting something that for review and contribution and evolution. Did Dave, you had one last?
Well, I was just struck by, it seems like you saw that from the opposite side from where I think Al was coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been on both sides of that, but I think it's less often that we want to stop and say, no, you're doing it the wrong way. You're asking me to build something that seems wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Although that does happen,
Yeah.
I think it's more the opposite of our department has a legitimate need to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And other people are saying, no, you can't do that. You can't use the data in that way. It's like, no, we gotta get our job done.
Yep.
Well, one thing that I think is important here is data shouldn't be approved based on use case. It should be approved based on kind of overarching rules about what is appropriate use of this data, what kind of function are you fulfilling, rather than what is your specific implementation. There are ways that we can kind of, there are things that we need to focus on with the what's your implementation, maybe security and kind of risk assessment, but in terms of data approvals, it shouldn't necessarily be based on David asked me versus Al asked me. If it's a similar usage, I don't know if that maybe gets to that point.
I also think though that if and as new needs emerge, the system and our standards have to evolve to address that, right? I mean, it just sort of saying, can't do it, not allowed, that doesn't feel like that's very satisfactory. I think that's maybe led to a lot of like alternate solutions to the same problems, right? Because folks haven't been able, they felt like they haven't been able to get access to the information or the data or the services that they feel like they need to. So I think a big part of this is like, let's work through those use cases and figure out a consistent way to work through them so it doesn't feel like it is a bunch of one-offs.
Yeah.
Or frustratingly, like brick walls everywhere when you're trying to accomplish your job.
Yeah.
I think a counterpoint to the not allowed is the not yet, which is a common reason that we end up with these extra pieces tacked on around campus to make something happen. Yes, that's something we're working toward, and we hope to have a solution for you in 2 to 3 years.
Not satisfactory.
Yeah.
Right? You have to do something now.
So if we can get to something that will give a standard for the data across campus, it makes those questions easier to answer because we don't figure out how to get them to talk to each other first.
Mhm.
One other point I want to add that has sort of gone through my mind as we've been talking is that one notion that we should start considering is who actually owns this data. I think today we often think about it in terms of the system where that data is located, maybe being as the data owner. But maybe we need to shift to a model where we say the person owns the data that's about them, and they should be empowered to make decisions about how it's being used. We'll see a little bit about that later on in our front stage presentation. But that may also change some of our data decision making that happens on this campus. We might be able to empower end users to actually make some of these choices when it comes to data about themselves.